Hello everyone, Shinto Bean here discussing some more Warhammer combat cards. In this video I'm going to be talking about traits. Now I've done a few videos on traits in the past, but in this one I'm going to be going a little bit more in depth, talking about specific examples where the traits work well, as well as scenarios where they're not so great. And I've broadly categorized the traits into two sections. On the left we've got things that I consider strong, and this is just my personal opinion, but I think these traits are very good in a wide variety of situations. Whereas on the right side, a lot of these traits can be quite good, but it just depends on the circumstance and your deck composition and the Warlord synergy and stuff like that. So I'm going to go through one by one, talk about each of these traits, and show you examples of cards, starting with Psionic Blast. Now I think Psionic Blast is easily one of the best traits in the game. It's usually reserved for very strong psychers like the Lord of Change, but it's extremely powerful because no matter where you deploy the card, it's guaranteed to always deal damage to all enemies on the field at the beginning of the turn. So it's really great for taking out low health enemies or things with shields, as well as just dealing tons of damage. There are some lower cost options which are still very good. And I've seen some people say that it's not so great on the Wraith Fighter because this thing actually has a pretty low psychic attack until you upgrade it quite a bit, but I think it still works well on the Wraith Fighter just for dealing with shields before it makes its main ranged attack. So overall, Psionic Blast, very powerful trait. Moving on to the ranged AoE trait, Barrage. Barrage is not quite as strong as Psionic Blast, but it's still very powerful, especially when you've got it on very strong ranged units like the Barracuda. And even the mid-ranged Barrage units tend to have a pretty high ranged attack, so you can get a lot of damage out of this, and they've gradually increased the amount of splash damage, the percentage. So at the moment it's dealing quite a lot of damage. Again, very good for taking out shields and low health enemies on the flanks. There are a couple very low cost cards with a Barrage, which can be good for dealing with shields, but I don't think it's really the best trait to have on those really low-cost cards like the Battle Sister there. Moving on, Inspiring Presence is a very good trait that provides a permanent boost to all of the attack power of your units on the field. And this one, I think, there are a ton of cards in the game with Inspiring Presence. There's some, like this Commissar, that are very cheap, and it's just for a couple points it can give you a considerable boost to your attack stats, so it's good on guys like that. And there are more expensive, more powerful cards as well, which benefit more from the Inspiring Presence themselves. It's also a great use of the trait. And then there are a number of Warlords that also have Inspiring Presence. I think it's a little less effective on Warlords like Aunva and the Mask, who just have a pretty weak, limited attack. But overall, I think in most situations, Inspiring Presence is a very solid trait. Moving on to Berserk. This is one of my personal favorites. It's a lot of fun. Some of the most insane amounts of damage in the game can be dealt through Berserk. And there are some really powerful ones. I think it's definitely best on units that have two attack types, both ranged and melee, because both of those attack types get increased every time they take damage. It's slightly less effective on cards that just have one attack type. There are a lot of melee berserkers, and if you can increase their health and keep them alive, they can still deal a lot of damage. It's just not quite as good as having a ranged attack as well. It's the weakest on the very low cost, low health units because they're just not going to survive long enough to get much out of the trait. Shields are a very strong trait and become much better as you upgrade the trait as well. Once you get to 3 or 4 shields, it starts to get a little ridiculous, the amount of damage that they're able to block. And you've got shields on really powerful units like the Annihilation Barge, which you want to be protecting, so it makes sense for that thing. You've also got cheaper bodyguards, which just can be very good at blocking your opponent's strongest cards and just holding down a lane. So like the Assault Terminator is a really popular one. And there are also a lot of shielded units that have kind of a weaker, they have a lot of health but not so much attack power, and I don't really like using these guys. I see them used quite a bit, and they can be good, but I just prefer units that tend to have more attack value for their cost. So that's just my personal preference. Moving on to some healing, we've got Medicae, which is a one-time heal that heals all of the units on the field. This is another very powerful trait, and it's best on very cheap bodyguards like this one. For 4 points, you can get a huge amount of value out of this when you put it down alongside some of your high-cost units. Some factions don't really have those very cheap options. Their Medicae cards are a little bit more expensive, but they can still be a very good way of healing up your units. And there are a couple higher cost cards with Medicae, which will benefit from the healing more themselves, but I think it's just better used. It's better trait for low cost cards rather than higher cost bodyguards. Moving on to Taunt. Likewise, Taunt works the best on low cost cards. There are a number of 3, 4, 5 point cards with Taunt, which can be very good at absorbing all of the enemy attacks and protecting your more valuable cards. But the higher the cost is on the Taunt cards, I think the weaker it becomes, the less effective it is. So things like the Venom Crawler, I don't really know why the thing has Taunt. And it's funny because actually, back in the day, when there were much fewer traits in the game, there were a lot of very expensive cards that had Taunt, like the Squig Buggy, the Sun Eater for Necrons, the Carnifex for Tyranids. Those actually had Taunt, which was really terrible choice for a trait because, you know, those are the cards that you want on the field for a long time because they're your damage dealers. So fortunately, they changed that, but again, the cheapest units are the best when it comes to Taunt. Outflank is a pretty strong ability because it both debuffs the enemy as well as buffing your own units, and there are a lot of, again, very cheap cards where you can get a lot of value, immediate value, from the Outflank. And it's still good, I think, on slightly more expensive cards. I know Tau have a lot of Outflankers, but on the super expensive cards, Outflank becomes kind of a wasted talent. I think you can imagine with something like the Valkyrie, how much better that would be if it had like Barrage. But yeah, in general, Outflank is pretty good. It doesn't stack so well, so you do have to be a little bit careful not to put too many cards with Outflank like on the same turn, but it's still a pretty useful trait, I think. Death Blow. Now, Death Blow is a pretty fun one. In order for it to activate, the card has to die, so it works best on glass cannons like the Solitaire, which deal a lot of melee damage, but have relatively low health, so they're pretty much guaranteed to die. And the Solitaire is especially good because it combos with the Avatar, which can increase its melee attack. It's not bad on really weak cards like the Bloodletter, if you just need a way to deal with with shields and stuff for melee decks, but it's not going to deal nearly as much damage, of course. And what I don't like Death Blow on is big cards like the Carnifex, which, number one, this thing doesn't even deal that much melee damage, but number two, it has so much health that it has a good chance of not even dying, and in that case you'll never see the Death Blow activate. Moving on to Psychic Link. Psychic Link is actually a really powerful trait, and it's better, of course, if your Psychers have higher attack power, because it is percentage based. You can potentially be dealing some insane amounts of damage, and Eldrad is a good example. He is actually, I think, the strongest Psyker with Psychic Link, and I've seen him deal 200 damage easily. So very good as long as your cards have a pretty high psychic attack, but of course guys like this little dude who have very low attack aren't really going to be getting much from the Psychic Link. Moving on to Fear. Fear is another powerful trait which is very frustrating to play against, and for that reason I'm kind of biased against it. I don't really like using it myself. Anyone who's seen a high level Keeper of Secrets, and this one is only at level 3, so it's not even that great, but this thing can be quite insane at the upper levels. Fear gets quite a bit stronger as you upgrade the trait. There are also a lot of weaker cards with Fear as well, which seem to be pretty popular, but I personally don't really like to use them. And on Warlords it can be pretty good just for protecting the Warlord a little more as well. Scout is a good way to provide an immediate boost to your next ranged or melee attack. And Tau really like their scouts. They're able to constantly increase their ranged attack, and it can be pretty good. The higher attack value on the card, the more damage that that unit will be dealing, but of course it applies to all of your units with that attack type. And of course it's best used when your deck is specializing in a single attack type. So you see it most in ranged decks. And of course, with the exception being boss Zagstruck, whose special rule synergizes amazingly well with Scout. It allows them to make an immediate attack for 100% of their melee damage on deployment. Regeneration. Now Regeneration is pretty fun, but its effectiveness, I think, largely depends on the type of bodyguard it has. For example, this little cheap guy, he's not really going to gain a whole lot from Regeneration because he doesn't really fulfill an important role on the battlefield as a weak melee unit. On things like Old One-Eye, they can be very tanky. This particular copy is a high enough level that it deals pretty good damage, but before level 5, Old One-Eye actually has a pretty weak melee attack, so not the greatest card. On the other hand, this guy, the Volgrar, he used to actually have Precision Shot, and it was a terrible card until they changed it to Regeneration. Now they also increased his damage, so he's a solid enough card that can survive for a very long time. And also, if you've played the latest campaign, the Rubric Marine, which is a new ranged unit for the forces of Tzeentch, that thing is really good and has Regeneration. Big Game Hunter is a pretty situational trait that I personally don't really like. There are quite a few very weak cards with Big Game Hunter, which doesn't make any sense at all because it's barely going to be dealing any more damage. And again, it only activates against cards that cost 40 or greater, and many decks don't even run any of those cards. Things like Kyriadraxis still don't deal enough damage for it to be very effective. However, it is quite good on glass cannons like this guy, who can take out a considerable chunk of health on even the toughest units. And on big guys like the Blastojet, these can also be very good because they deal enough damage to easily deal with weaker units as well as high cost units. Alright, moving on to Precision Shot, Furious Charge, and Warp Surge. These all essentially do the same thing, so I've lumped them into one category. These are not the best trait, but they can be good in situations where if they are deployed across a low health card, you can take it out before it gets a chance to attack or retaliate. Of course, the best use of these traits is on units that deal a lot of damage. So like on Scumbo, it's really not going to do very much. However, anyone who's played against boss, what's his name? Badrock, Captain Badrock, there we go. Anyone who's played against Captain Badrock can attest to the power of the Dakajet, which has a very powerful Precision Shot. And the Precision Shot can actually cause the special rule to trigger again, so yeah, it's very strong on that one. Furious Charge also, it combos very well with Skull Taker for one thing, but again, in general, it's just the higher the melee attack on the card, the more damage it'll be dealing. Warp Surge is actually the weakest of the three. There are only a couple cards in the game with Warp Surge, and it doesn't really synergize with any Warlords, and I feel like the Psychers with Warp Surge were just the ones that are not cool enough to get Psionic Blast or Psychic Link, so it's not really that great of a trait. Moving on to Target Acquired. Now this one is a very situational trait that a lot of players did not really like to use when it was first released. More recently, they gave it a little damage buff that makes it slightly better, but it still remains quite situational. However, a lot of the cards that have the trait are pretty powerful ranged units. Of course, it combos amazingly well with Boss Snickrot, so if you're running him, you definitely want to make use of Target Acquired. And then the Jackal Alphys, the new Tyranid Warlord, has a special version of Target Acquired called Deadshot that allows it to target the enemy Warlord, and in that case, it is one of the strongest traits in the game. Being able to just snipe the enemy Warlord in a single turn is very good, but normal Target Acquired cannot do that. Moving on to Endless. Endless allows the card to redeploy once it's been destroyed for the first time, and this card is, this trait can be good when comboed with Warlords that benefit from it. For example, the Poxwalker is very good when comboed with Gloggerthrox the Foul, and the Cadian Guardsman works very nicely with Commissar Yarick and Magos Dominus, but Endless can also be a little risky to use because a lot of warlords benefit from destroying units multiple times, like a number of the Eldari warlords as well as a few Orc warlords as well. Tyranids have a lot of endless units, but they don't really have any warlords that synergize with them, so it's not really that great of a trait, I think. And then finally, we've got Poison. Poison is just not an amazing trait. There are only a handful of factions that really utilize Poison. It can be good at dealing damage over time, dealing with things that are normally tough to kill off, like cards with Fear and Shields and Taunt and whatnot. You've got your weaker units that can just deploy and maybe poison one thing before they die, or more tougher, stronger cards with poison that can potentially poison multiple enemies. But it takes a very long time for the damage to work down the enemies, so sometimes you'll see it make a difference, other times not so much. And then there are a couple units that are very low cost but only have one attack type, and those I think are not really quite as good. So anyway, that is all of the traits in a nutshell, with examples of good and bad cards. And so let me know what you think, if you agree with the analysis that I have here. A lot of it is based on personal experience and my opinion, so I'm sure that there are players who would disagree with some of these ideas, but hopefully this was helpful to newer players as well as veterans alike. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.